When we read the opening line of John's Gospel in English, it seems, well, fairly straightforward, doesn't it? The Word was God. But what if that familiar wording is not the only way the original Greek can be understood? And what if the way it has been translated reflects more than just the Greek grammar? So in this episode, we will look carefully at what the text actually says and how the translation can shape what we believe it means. So let's take a closer look at the opening line of John's Gospel. See, in English, it's usually translated, John chapter 1 and verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." However, the original Greek reads slightly differently. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word." Now, that may sound like a small difference, but it really matters. Why? Well, because in Koine Greek, this is the common dialect and the language of the Septuagint and, of course, the New Testament scriptures. The order of words is often used for emphasis. Here, God was the Word. The word God is placed at the beginning of the final phrase. So rather than simply identifying the Word as God, the sentence is actually drawing attention to the nature or the quality of the Word. In other words, it is descriptive, like an adjective. And of course, there is another important detail that we have to take account of. See, in Greek, nouns have a definite article, like the word "the" in English. However, there is no indefinite article in Koine Greek, like "a" in English. So, in the phrase, "the Word was with God," the word God includes that article. It is referring clearly to the God, ho theos. And I've put a link for BibleHub.com. You can actually check this out. However, notice the final phrase, "God was the Word." The word God, theos, does not have the article ho in front of it. Now that difference has led to different ways of understanding the sentence. Some translate this way, "The Word was God." Others, well, it has the Word was divine. Divine being, of course, descriptive. And some have even translated it as "the Word was a God." Notice the English indefinite article "a" is introduced into the text. So what does this mean? Well, it means that the Greek wording itself allows for more than one way of expressing the idea in English. And that brings us to a really important point here. See, translation, well, it's not about just words. It also involves interpretation. The translator has to decide how best to express the meaning, and that decision can be influenced by how the translator, understands the text as a whole. So, before we draw any conclusions, we need to recognize something simple but really important. The Greek text gives us the wording, but the way that wording is translated can shape how we understand it. So the question is not simply what the text says, but how it is being understood. Remember, in a previous video, we examined two words, Messiah, which was translated Christos in Greek. Now, the words were translated correctly, but the meaning fell on different ears and therefore meant different things depending on which ear was doing the hearing. You know, remember, Hebrew saw it one way, the Gentiles saw it another way. Both the same word translated correctly. So, now let's do something similar and place the different translation possibilities. Put them side by side. See, the Greek phrase actually and literally reads, "And God was the Word." From this, three main ways of expressing it in English will have been suggested. The first one, the Word was God. Now, this is the most familiar translation, and it presents a sort of direct identification of the Word. Then we have, secondly, the Word was divine. And this focuses on the nature or the quality of the Word rather than its identity. And then finally, the third way, the Word was a God. And this treats the term in a more sort of general sense, though this is less commonly accepted in the mainstream translations. So what we're looking at here is not three different texts. It is one Greek sentence expressed in different ways through the process of translation. And each way reflects a particular understanding of how that sentence should be read. And of course, this brings us back to the central question. Are we simply reading the Greek text, or are we reading an interpretation of that text? Now, this simple layout, on one side we've got the Greek text, kai theos en ho logos. On the other side, which is the main focus, the Word was God. Now, this is according to the BSB translation, which we've read. Or the Word was divine, and this is Goodspeed Bible and the Moffat translation. And then finally, the Word was a God, and we'll find this in the New World Translation. And of course, the bottom line is, it's one Greek phrase with different translations. Now, I'm preparing a detailed summary of this subject, so let me know if you wish to have a copy, for your reference purposes. But it's not complete yet, so I'll let you know when it's done. So having seen that the Greek wording, it allows for more than one way of expressing the idea, the next question naturally focuses on what follows. How do translators decide which wording to use? See, at first glance, we might assume that translation is simply a matter of converting one language into another. However, in reality, translation often involves choices, and those choices are shaped by how the translator understands the text. For example, if a translator already understands the Word to be fully identified as God himself, then the translation, "the Word was God," well, it would seem to be the most natural and accurate way of translating it. If, however, the focus is understood to be on the nature or the quality of the Word, then "the Word was divine," well, that may be preferred. So the difference is not in the Greek text itself, the difference lies in how the text is being understood. Now, this does not mean that translators are being careless. No, far from it. It simply reflects the fact that translation is never completely neutral. It is influenced by the language, the context, and often by long-standing sort of theological traditions. See, over time, certain ways of expressing key passages become familiar. And those familiar forms are really passed down through generations of translation. And as a result, what we read today may reflect not only the original wording, but also the sort of history of how that wording has been understood. So the question we must ask is not whether the text has changed. It certainly has not. The question is whether our translation of the text has been shaped by interpretation. And if so, how that affects the way we understand what the gospel is actually saying. So, we're not dealing with different Bibles, but with different ways of expressing the same Greek text. So having considered now how translation involves interpretation, we can now return to the gospel itself. Because ultimately, the question is not only how a sentence is translated, but how the gospel presents Jesus throughout its narrative. Now, near the end of the Gospel of John, we are given a clear statement of purpose. John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Now, this statement is simple and clearly very direct, isn't it? And it also reflects the language of the Hebrew scriptures, the expectation of the Messiah and the understanding of the Son of God within that context. So, now we need to ask an important question. Does this statement reflect the same idea that is often drawn from the opening line? The Word was God. Or are we looking at two different ways of expressing who Jesus actually is? Now, throughout the Gospel, we see Jesus teaching, we see him healing, we see him interacting with people. And he speaks of God as his Father. He prays to God. He is presented as the one sent by God. Now, all of this fits naturally within the language of the Messiah, the Son of God. So, when we come back to the opening statement about the Word, we are faced once again with a choice. Do we interpret the whole gospel through that opening line, or do we understand that opening line in the light of the gospel as a whole? Because the text itself invites us to consider that question carefully. John chapter 20 and verse 31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So, as we step back from what we have explored, well, a clear distinction begins to emerge. The Greek text presents the wording. The translation expresses that wording in another language. And interpretation seeks to understand what that wording means. So, in the case of the opening line of this Gospel of John, we have seen that the Greek text allows for more than one way of expressing the idea. But we have also seen that translation involves choices, and those choices can be influenced by how the text is understood. However, when we return to the gospel itself, its stated purpose is clear, is it not? Is there any ambiguity here? That you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Is there any ambiguity in that? Well, I don't see any. So the question we're left with is not simply how John 1 and verse 1 should be translated. The deeper question is this. See, are we allowing the gospel as a whole to define its message, i.e. through the process of exegesis, that is, to allow the scriptures to reveal themselves to us? Or are we allowing one line, as translated, to shape how we read everything else? See, the text itself has not changed, but how we understand it may depend on how we approach the subject. And that is something each of us must consider carefully. And as always, the invitation of the gospel, well, it remains, to read carefully and to understand faithfully. Now, there is another passage that helps us see how this really works in practice. In Acts chapter 28, see, when Paul survives the snake bite, people say that he is a god. Now, in the Greek, the same word is used here, theos, but without the definite article, no ho in front of it. And in this case, it is translated a god. Now, this shows that the absence of the article does not by itself determine how the word should be translated. Context is always important. But it is also important to recognize that this is a different kind of sentence from the opening of John's Gospel. We have to recognize both sides. So while it helps us to understand how the language works, it does not on its own settle the meaning of John chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, it is helpful to understand why the wording in John's Gospel is not quite the same as what we see in the book of Acts. Because in Acts chapter 28, when the people say that Paul is a god, well, the sentence is simple and direct. See, they are reacting to what they have seen and describing Paul in really a straightforward way. However, the wording in John's Gospel, John 1:1, well, it's different. Instead of saying the word was God in a simple form, the Greek places the word God at the beginning of the phrase. God was the Word. And this change in word order is important, really important. And why is it important? Because in Greek, placing a word at the beginning of a sentence often gives it emphasis. So rather than simply identifying the word, the sentence is drawing attention to what the word is like. In other words, the focus is not only on identity, but on the nature or the character of the word. And that makes this phrase more descriptive than the simple statement we find in the book of Acts. So it's not just the words themselves, but how they are arranged that really shapes the meaning. Now, while both passages use the same word, theos, the way that word is used, well, it's not the same. And that is why we need to be careful not to treat them as if they were the same or identical even. Now, in our next video, we will examine more closely not only what Lord Jesus gathered or adhered to, but also how he explained it and how the Gospel of John really narrates his role. So, thank you once again for watching, and we'll see you next time.